I've mentioned on this show that insulin resistance is often a muscle problem, that building muscle is one of the best things you can do for your metabolic health. And I truly believe that. But my guest today, a diabetes specialist with 22 years of clinical experience, says you can lift heavy, you can have solid muscle mass, and still be insulin resistant. Today, she's going to walk us through at least 5 warning signs that your metabolism is in trouble even if you train hard. We get into muscle mass versus muscle quality, how to test for insulin resistance proactively, long before A1C becomes a problem, and midlife changes to your body composition and sexual health that have nothing to do with your effort in the gym. Plus, the one thing almost every lifter is under-eating that directly affects how your muscles handle glucose. That's all coming up. Welcome to Wits and Weights, where in every episode we put a popular piece of fitness advice under the microscope, find the hidden reason it doesn't work, and give you the deceptively simple fix that does. I'm your host, Philip Pape, and today's premise that we're going to challenge is build muscle and you'll fix your insulin resistance. It's advice I've given on this show. It's backed by evidence, but it's not quite the whole story. So my guest today is Amber Wilhoit, a registered dietitian and certified diabetes care and education specialist who has spent over 2 decades working with patients in clinical diabetes care. She's the host of the Diabetes Podcast, which you should go follow right now and check out the episode we did together, the Diabetes Podcast, and the founder of Empowered Diabetes, where she helps adults with type 2 diabetes and prediabetes achieve remission through lifestyle changes. So today, Amber is going to walk us through at least 5 signs that you might be insulin resistant even if you lift weights, including muscle mass versus muscle quality. We'll talk about proactive blood work. We'll talk about early signs to look for and some tips you can implement this week. Amber, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
I've said on this show, I talk a lot about insulin resistance and sensitivity related to a lack of muscle and related to a lack of movement, aka fitness, not just as a carb or blood sugar problem, but given that you've worked with diabetes patients for a long time now, right? That's your expertise. How big of a factor in the pie is fitness when it comes to insulin resistance?
Oh my gosh. It's a huge factor because skeletal muscle plays such a predominant role in taking in glucose in the absence of I think of the way the body takes in insulin insulin is the key that unlocks the door to this body cell and lets the glucose get inside where energy can be made. So when you have excess adiposity, especially around the midsection, especially around your visceral organs, which are your lungs, your heart, your liver, your intestines, then you are more resistant to the insulin that your body produces. So then the pancreas gets the signal, we need more, and it puts out more insulin. But the muscles can act like a sponge and use other pathways beyond, needing that insulin key to the lock, one being the GLUT4 pathway, where it can act like a sponge and take in that excess glucose from the bloodstream. So skeletal muscle is really key in fixing part of that problem.
Okay. And that's good to know, right? Because we are on one hand saying that is important. And on the other hand, I do want to cover what other things are important because that's not the whole story. But 2 things I want to unpack there. The first is the excess adiposity you mentioned, visceral fat around the organs, which a lot of people want to get rid of for multiple reasons, including aesthetics, but also it's super important to your health. I like what you said, though. You are more resistant to insulin when you have it. So it's almost this vicious cycle. The more you have it, the more you can get until, right? Is that kind of how it works?
Absolutely. Yeah. I often refer to it as a snowball effect that one leads into the next, which leads into the next. And so it's also about when we talk about genetics and the role that it plays, it's not as much as most people think. It has more to do with where you store your fat genetically than it does a genetic predisposition, because genes take thousands of years to really change. But then you do have something called epigenetics. So you have like a dimmer switch that can be moved up or moved down, but your environment really shapes whether that dimmer gets moved up or down.
Yeah.
So you could be a person who stores more fat around your hips and butt and thighs. We call that a pear body shape. And your insulin resistance, your diabetes risk would be lower than someone who tends to store more fat around their abdomen, that what we call an apple body shape. And we have something called a waist to hip ratio, which is one way to measure that. And typically in women, you want a waist to hip ratio that's below 0.85. So you measure the smallest part of your waist and the largest part of your hips, and you divide one into the other, whichever one makes sense. No, I'm just kidding. But you divide the larger to the smaller, and then you get your ratio. And for men, you want it less than 0.9. So if it's greater than that, you're at a greater risk for cardiovascular disease, insulin resistance, diabetes, and so on.
So that's important. I love that you went right to data and measurements. I literally just recorded a walkthrough video of a physique tracker that I have. And in one of those things is waist to hip and then like weight to height and different things. So I have a quick question. Is waist to hip ratio like pretty much the simplest, best way to go? Or do you also look at like the body roundness index is one that I've seen that's replacing BMI? Like, do you have any others that you use?
I really like waist to hip ratio. It's so simple, and it's one of the most researched when it comes to visceral adiposity, to look at that. And then if you're really looking at biomarkers like early intervention for things like prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, which I believe people should be looking at because the statistics around this are amazing. So 1 in 2 adults in the United States has either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, which is just phenomenal when you think of the greater your age, the more your risk for diabetes. So if you really took another slice of that older population, it's definitely going to be greater than 1 in 2. So one way to know your risk really early on, there are things like your A1C, which if you go on the American Diabetes Association website, you can see different like clinical markers to diagnose prediabetes and diabetes. One is your A1C test, which measures the glucose levels that are attached to your red blood cells. And your red blood cells live about 3 months, so they can measure that and then get an idea of how the sugar's been circulating in your bloodstream for 3 months. But that's not really going to be elevated until you've already had a great degree of insulin resistance and you've already had a great degree of fasting insulin levels. So that it starts with those fasting insulin levels being higher. So that's another test that's completely underutilized. So back to your question, I like waist to hip ratio because it's cheap. You can do it today, you could do it in the next 5 minutes. But fasting insulin levels are another pretty inexpensive test that you could get done. And if the number is 5, if it's under 5, you're good. If your number is 5 to 10, then you've got some level of some early insulin resistance that could be possible. If it's 10 to 20, it would be moderate insulin resistance. And then greater than 20, you've probably got some very significant insulin resistance going on. And that's going to affect your inflammation levels and that avalanche effect.
So fasting insulin, is that typically tested as part of normal labs that people get, or do you have to ask for it?
You have to ask for it. It's not typical, very underutilized.
And is it affected by the environment of the study, or what I'm trying to say, the situation, like what you've eaten and all that, because it's fasting, right?
Right. So you want to, who knew fasting would be like
that
not
part
eating?
seemed obvious, but yeah.
No, it's okay. I think it is important to spell it out because if people are going to be doing this, it's important that they know what they're asking for and they know how they would show up for the lab test. And so it's a blood draw, and you would want to be fasted for 8 to 12 hours prior to that test. And with this one, you actually would not want to do your wits and weights workout before that lab. You don't want to exercise day of, and you wouldn't want to have caffeine coffee, even though it's no sugar, no cream. You wouldn't want that before that test as well, because that could increase the insulin levels.
That actually makes sense, right? Because when you work out, you're changing the dynamics of the insulin in your bloodstream and where they go. And I think that is related to the GLUT4 transporter as well that you mentioned. Maybe
That
we can,
GLUT4 pathway.
the pathway. Maybe we could dive into that a little bit so people know what that is.
Well, it's just essentially an alternate route. If you think of, I like to use Waze, and some people hate it, some people love it. I really enjoy it to get me where I'm going and avoid traffic jams and the like. So think of insulin resistance as the traffic jam, and Waze is going to divert your path around this. So it's another way to get glucose into the cells, which is what your body needs to have happen in the absence of, it overcomes that resistance. It is a way to get it directly into the muscle where the energy is needed. Create ATP, you get all that Krebs cycle goodness that we learned. I don't want to say how many years ago, almost 30 years ago. But yeah, it's just allows your muscles to get the energy that it needs. And the better trained you are, the better that GLUT4 pathway is going to be. The more skeletal muscle you have, the more sponges you have, the more water you're going to be able to soak up.
So that's a good point, right? Because sometimes we think about transitory effects and then long-term effects. And I know we talk about training a lot as having both benefits of while you're training, amazing things happen in the process of when you're in the gym and right after as you're recovering and as you adapt the next few days and then long-term. So when it comes to insulin resistance, you mentioned the GLUT4 is, I guess, amplified when you have more muscle tissue is because you just have more of those or more that are switching on.
Yeah. But I think it really comes down to what you see in terms of, for my experience, has been people who have altered glucose metabolism, who have type 2 diabetes, mostly, sometimes pre-diabetes. But in these individuals that you really can, more than most, see the effect of a response to exercise on blood sugar levels. You see for 48 hours, the blood sugars being more level than days where they don't have their normal activity or workout. And it was my very first introduction to this was maybe 19, 20 years ago when I was counseling someone and their glucose levels were just gorgeous, like morning fastings were in the range of somebody who didn't have diabetes. All the 2-hour post-meal glucoses that this person recorded. So 2 hour would be when you would expect it that the insulin would peak and kind of get out of the system after the meal. So the 2-hour post-meal levels you would want to see less than 140 in people who have diabetes. And so all of those were under 140. Beautiful. And then there was this one day where, or like a couple of days in there where the fastings were in the 180s, 190s, and then they got up to 220, 280 after meals. And I'm like, what happened here? And he was like, oh, that was a really stressful time and I wasn't able to get my workout in and I didn't get much sleep. And it just goes to prove what the research also supports, that stress and high cortisol levels and low sleep can really have an impact on your glucose levels and the way that you utilize, the inflamed nature that you are in that situation. So a lot of outputs and it's neat to see the proof in the pudding.
So the GLUT4 thing, just to nerd out on it one more time, is, when you're strength training and using your muscles, it activates those, but also walking does, right? Like just movement in general. How did they compare? Do you know?
I don't know offhand. I would say that it has more to do with how your VO2 max and how trained you are across time. Talk about transient effects. Like if you look at, for example, the fats that is in a muscle cell, the fat stored in there, your myofascial fat stores, you can take somebody who is very well trained and they would have more than an untrained person in some circumstances, have more fat in their muscle. But they're not going to have the typical results you would see with people with a lot of fat in their muscle because they're well trained. So the pathways are just different in how it utilizes it. And they haven't fully extrapolated like what's causing that exactly. But you have especially in endurance athletes, they have a lot of fat stored in their muscle. And if you think about it, the liver can store around 250 grams of glucose And so if you're doing a marathon and you're using massive amounts of glucose, but during the race and then even afterwards, as you're repairing and rebuilding from the race, you're using more glucose than you can really kind of eat. And most people eat about 200 to 250 grams of glucose a day, or carbs a day. That it makes sense to be able to store it in the muscle and have it directly where it is needed for more endurance base. Now, it's not going to help you in a sprint necessarily because you use a different pathway, but to be able to utilize that, it just shows that people who are well trained don't have that same negative response to fat storage in and around the muscle cells that you do with people who are not.
Okay, this is really fascinating. So you're talking about like fat infiltration in the muscles, which we don't talk about a lot here. And what comes to mind for me is clients I've worked with who are very well muscled, and they are, super strong, very well muscled, and their blood work looks pretty good actually, even if they're carrying a lot of extra body weight. But like they might not have a great resting heart rate because they're not walking or something like that. It's interesting, these different health variables and what they're affected by. So are you saying that, well, I'm going to make two assumptions. You can tell me if I'm wrong. The first assumption is...
I will try. I didn't read that study yesterday, but I'll try.
Somebody with more muscle, despite having more fat in general, which also means in their muscles, is still going to have a slight advantage for some of the health outcomes we're talking about. That's assumption one. And then assumption two is there a difference then in someone who's well muscled who has more versus less fat in their muscles?
Okay. Yes. So what I was referring to before was sort of this study I read a while ago about like a meta-analysis of looking at people who were well-trained endurance athletes versus lean individuals versus obese individuals, overweight obese individuals. And they found that just in the lean individuals who are well-trained, that excess fat in the muscle was not detrimental to their overall health. In fact, the opposite was true. Versus the lean and the lean untrained and the overweight obese didn't have those same positive benefits from the fat in the muscle. Is actually a negative effect.
So I was thinking, I've seen data suggesting that total muscle mass isn't significantly different between metabolically healthy and metabolically unhealthy people. And that could be a matter of when you're overweight, you have more muscle, even though but you also
you're
have more
carrying
fat.
more weight. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, and then there's this muscle quality issue. Is that something that you could tell us more about?
The only things I've seen regarding muscle quality, because I am a one-trick diabetes pony. So for me, is the muscle well-trained? Can it act like a better sponge to soak in excess glucose? And that's going to come from, in general, it's going to come better from people who exercise at least 30 minutes, at least 5 days a week, from people who have less central adiposity, meaning they have less visceral fat and fat stored around their internal organs, and they manage their sleep and stress well. I am a little too removed from all the exercise physiology studies to do a better job than that.
That's helpful to know, right? Because you're connecting everything we just talked about. Now, I always tell people, look, wherever you're starting from, you have some advantage. If you're overweight, your advantage is you have extra body fat to draw from, and you'll probably respond better, to certain things, right?
Yes. And so speaking to the part that you said about more muscle in people who are overweight or obese, that is true. And I agree with what you said, to use it to your advantage. And in fact, one little trick up our sleeve that we've used with people that we work with is, if you have lost 5 pounds in the past 2 weeks, guess what? You're going to now walk with a rucksack with an extra 5 pounds in it. If you've lost 15 pounds, you're going to walk with a rucksack with that, because it tends to be true that as you lose weight, it's not all fat loss. You lose muscle with it. You lose your bone mass, lean body mass type stuff. So the idea behind that is we want to keep your body thinking that you're still that same weight muscle wise. You got to hold on to that muscle because it still benefits you. but let's let go of the fat, the extra fat, and of course that comes from the composition of the foods. We look at processed foods in the diet and trying to increase fiber intake and just the overall quality of nutrition with the exercise. And I know your part of your program also encompasses that, which I think is amazing. So I think you can out eat any medicine, you can out eat any exercise. And that's why you have to also pay attention to nutrition on top of the exercise and movement portion. It's crucial though.
Yeah, and I love that hack too. That's actually a really good hack that people should pay attention to of like, even if you're not extremely overweight, anybody in a fat loss phase, what if you just start adding that weighted vest or that rucksack or, making things a little bit harder from a load perspective, not going overboard with understanding you have recovery capacity issues and things. But if you are overweight, one of the advantages, you shouldn't have as much recovery sapped from you because you have those fat stores to draw from. At the same time, you may not have the work capacity or the cardio capacity yet too. So you got to balance it all for the person, right?
Yes. And we use it more than just for that purpose. We call it a gratitude pack, because if you've lost 10 or 15 pounds and at the end of that walk, you take that 15 pounds off, you feel so light. And it's like, whoa, I used to carry that around all the time. So it's just a shift in perspective. And I think anytime you can get outside of your head and outside of just what you always do and do something different, think of something differently, then you can really experience change for the positive in that space. So that's also how we use them.
That's awesome. Shifting a little bit here, we talked a little bit about the visceral fat component of it. And I know a lot of my listeners are women in their 40s and 50s, and they're dealing with perimenopause and changing hormones that have their own independent effects, especially the decline in estrogen, on that extra, even more fat storage. And they haven't changed anything, right? So they're super frustrated. They're like, and maybe they are training, maybe they're all doing all the things. So what's happening at the metabolic level that's maybe relevant to what you brought up already about adiposity for the hormone stuff? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's definitely estrogen and the way that it shifts where you tend to store fat. It does have an effect on whether you store fat in your legs and your butt and your hips versus your abdomen. And it is more likely around and after menopause to be stored around your internal organs. And that is the most dangerous place to store it. And so unfortunately, it's not enough to do what you've always done and have the same outcomes or look the same way. Unfortunately, you have to think like, what more can I do? What other fine tuning knob can I adjust here? And sometimes it feels like I'm already doing it all. What more could I add in? So you really have to look at what is the impact of stress and sleep, because if you're fighting against cortisol all the time and stress hormones, you're just going to be pushing that rock up a hill like Sisyphus, and you've got to find ways to manage and look at that. And I think a lot of that can come into play. I'm 40, almost 49. So I'm at that peri stage, and it is important I have to spend more time and attention thinking about what I'm doing to set myself up for success, to get a good bedtime and get good sleep and wake up around the same time every morning to help with the circadian rhythms and that as well. And just, it takes more focus, but not always more effort, if that makes sense. It takes better systems,
intention,
which I think you're all about, and intention. Yeah.
Okay. So two things came up in my brain. The first is related to insulin resistance at that age and specifically in that population. So is there an independent increase that we see in insulin resistance because of those hormonal changes, independent of the other factors?
So what I will just speak in general statements is that as people age in general, and especially worsened by estrogen and where it causes women to store fat more around the internal organs, that's going to increase insulin resistance. That's going to increase the shuttling of the triacylglycerols to the liver. That's going to put someone at greater risk for fatty liver. And all of those things are going to be going against blood sugar levels and against metabolic homeostasis where it is now. So it would get worse with age, mostly because also with age, we tend to lose lean body mass. So it's a couple of factors.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then the trap, I think a lot of women have told me they find themselves in is like the weight loss resistance combined with the stress, combined with now I feel more desperate to do something about it. And they all seem like counteracting forces. You know, my program is called Eat More, Lift Heavy for a reason, because I'm trying to encourage people to think differently, not just to eat more ad libitum, whatever, but more of let's support the fuel side of things rather than restricting that side, but then fix the other stuff like training and, like you said, sleep. So like, where would you stack the priority of those pillars? Obviously they're all important, but when you got sleep, managing stress, food as in eating enough food, or also versus trying to diet and lose fat, because losing fat and could also be good for your health depending. Like, how would you stack those in general?
I'm going to go from bottom up instead of top to bottom, if I may.
Like a pyramid, you mean, or like the least priority?
Like least priority first.
Okay, got it.
I would, because there's only one of those. When you were saying, I was like, ooh, I don't really like that one. The rest were fine. But I don't like restrictive eating styles in general. Like most women are over restricting, at least to some degree. And if they're under restricting most of the time, then that also can bring about some binge eating at other times. And then you get things like cheat days. And there's a fantastic app, your app, of course. There's any app that can track your calories. If you wanted to do that, I would recommend anybody do it for 2 weeks. It's not really fun, but it's good to just kind of have a marker of where you are. And it's so eye-opening to see, like, you could be in a calorie deficit Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And let's say you were under by 200 calories all those days. So you got 1,000-calorie deficit going into the weekend, but then you have a brunch, you've got a baby shower, you've got some event scheduled, and you easily eat those 1,000 calories between Saturday and Sunday and different events. And so you think, oh, I've been so good during the week, and food does not have a moral value. I think it's important to say that. And then you've suffered, if you will, this entire week, and just to have a little bit of fun on the weekend, if you will, and it just completely came out dead even, which is okay. Depends on what your goals are. You know, your goal might to just be keeping it dead even. You know, it might be that I'm restricting here so that I can have this fun on the weekend and eat things that I want. I think where people get into trouble is if they over focus on everything and they think they have shame within themselves for what they eat, or label different foods as something that they never eat, they don't eat. Like I said, food doesn't have a moral value. I think that's where people get into trouble. I think also when you have a lot of processed foods in your diet, and by diet, I just mean the food that you eat in a day and in your lifetime. And processed foods would be anything that you can't go into your pantry and normally find. Like, you don't have xanthan gum in your pantry. You don't have carrageenan in your pantry. So that sort of thing. You just want to keep it with things you could have in your pantry. And I don't want to say the less ingredients, the better, but as a general rule, that works well too. But really looking of how I can add things. And we talked about this before, and I'm a strong proponent of looking at where you are. And instead of thinking of restriction and cutting back, and none of those words are fun, you know, like how do you add in more fiber? How do you add in more fruits and vegetables? How do you add in more color? So nutrition is way up there for me. So in that, I want you to add nutritious foods. I want to take away things that are really stealing joy from your life in terms of restrictive types and behaviors of ways of eating. And I mean, for me, exercise is super important. I schedule in my activity in my week and in my day before anything else. Like that's what I do first thing in the morning because I just want to get it. Not that I want to get it done because I really enjoy it. It's not one of those things like swallow that frog. I want to get it over and done with. I want to move my body. I feel the best when I move my body. I eat better when I think of it in terms that I've moved my body and now I want to fuel my body well. So, nutrition, exercise, those are the top two for me. Sleep is important, of course, because I can't move my body well if I'm dragging along, performance wise. That's also why, the things that I have cut out of my nutrition are, I used to have the occasional drink here and there and people, if you enjoy that, fine. But for me, when I would drink the night before and then run, even if it was just a glass of wine, when I would run the next morning, my performance would suffer. And it just didn't pass the worth it line for me. So for others, it does. It wasn't. When I can notice my performance suffer because of something I've done through sleep or nutrition, I'm going to cut it out. That's my personal preference.
I'm going to requote you right now. Does it pass the worth it line? Does it pass the worth it line? That's so good. Some of this stuff is binary. Like you mentioned training. I would tell no one that zero trainings is acceptable. You have to train. I would agree. But then it's a matter of degrees and like frequency and all that. Sleep, everybody has to sleep, but then it's a function of, okay, now where do you make the trade-off between your schedule for training, for sleep, and then like just fitting fun stuff in for stress? Like how does somebody make all that work, Amber, when your population you deal with is just like stressed out of their mind?
Yeah, no kidding. Because in general, I work with a group of people who have a lot of stress because there's so many more decisions they have to make in a given day that somebody without type 1, type 2, pre-diabetes, type C, monogenic diet, any of these types of diabetes has to worry about because they're thinking about, okay, I'm going to eat. How much insulin should I take for that amount of carbs? What's my ratio of insulin to carbs? So if I'm having 45 grams of carbs and I'm on a 1-8, then I need to give this many units. And then my sugar, I need to add those many units in. So I'm giving 9 units for that. But then, I'm going to exercise afterwards. And I don't want my sugar to go low. So I have to take it away, which is why technology has really helped in this space ease a lot of the burden with continuous glucose monitors and automated insulin delivery devices. Your GLP-1 class of medications, your SGLT2 receptor agonists. So all of these are, SGLT2 inhibitors, GLP-1 receptor agonists. All of these help, but I'm a firm believer in doing as much as you can through nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress management. And then if you need the scaffolding to support the other, unfortunately, people who have type 1 diabetes, that scaffolding is needed forever. They have to have insulin to survive. But if you could not have it and get away with it, wouldn't you want to do that?
What about, I know one thing that I think you've covered on your podcast is like sexual health and diabetes, which, erectile dysfunction and arousal and all those things that are important. And we don't talk about it enough sometimes. I talk about libido in the context of hormones and stress and energy, but where does this connect with the diabetes world?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to understand that in the diabetes world, if you are over age 80, there's something like a 98% chance that you have erectile dysfunction. And if you're over age 70, it's still somewhere like a 75% chance. I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but it is an astounding number of people. So you have this chronic disease that showed up in your life when you're 65. And on top of that, you've noticed your libido is in the toilet and your quality of life has thus decreased. And so I see so many men, especially, but it's not necessarily just men. Women have some of the same sexual dysfunction issues, but they're like, well, got to die somehow. And they're just don't always have a lot to live for once the spice of life, if you will, has been taken away. So, but now let's talk about more people in their 40s and 50s. If you think of the risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, so they are ugly best friends. They go hand in hand. And a lot of people who come in with a heart attack are then diagnosed with type 2 diabetes because it's all that metabolic disease process. And erectile dysfunction can be an early sign that something cardiovascular is not firing on all cylinders, that there's some issues there. And so when we talk about insulin resistance and that excess fat shuttling to the liver, it also shuttles to the arteries and can get in the intermedia there in the blood vessel walls. And it makes these foam cells in there that are highly inflammatory, very sticky, and people can throw a clot. And so it's very important that cardiovascular health is looked at in this whole picture, because heart disease is the number one killer in the United States. And I think it would be we would be really remiss to not look at disease risk there and the way that insulin resistance plays a role in that, and the fact that half of all adults have either diabetes or prediabetes. Half. So as you age, it's going to be more. And then if diabetes and heart disease are interlinked, and cardiovascular dysfunction and sexual dysfunction are interlinked, you see it all matters.
All those are linked with obesity, right? Which is also linked with the upstream root causes of obesity, which is, for whatever reason, full of controversy because there's always talk of the end of the stream, like diet and exercise and nutrition and all that, or calories in, calories out. But at the end of the day, these diseases of aging, they probably didn't exist at all at a certain point in human history, and now they do. Exactly. And it's not just a function of longevity, because people could have lived to the 90s a long time ago. There's a myth about that for some reason. But yeah, it's because of the lifestyle, right?
I don't know. I think you also need to look at the environment. The environment plays a huge role. Yes. And the reason I think the environment is so important is because if you look in just 100 years ago, but if you look at that time period, you didn't have the prevalence of heart disease and type 2 diabetes that you have now. 11.7% of the population has diabetes, but in 1920, it was less than 1%. Mm-hmm. So what has changed the most? I would say it's the environment, and then that comes into the food supply and policies and just so many things, industrialization, lots of stuff.
At which point in the stream, like when I say lifestyle, I'm thinking the environment affects your lifestyle, but then you could go one step further and say, well, where does this environment come from? Yeah. And can we do something about it? But okay, to make it maybe a little more positive here, let's switch to nutrition a little bit, because there was a note that I had we didn't get to, and that is, we talk about protein a lot, but I want to hear your take on fiber, because that is super, super important. Yeah. And maybe more important for some people. Is it? I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah. Well, our national guidelines recommend 25 to 35 grams of fiber a day. World Health Organization guidelines recommend 25 grams of fiber a day. If you have type 2 diabetes, they recommend 30 grams of fiber a day. The average person in the world gets about 20 grams of fiber a day. But then when you cut the United States pie into that, we're looking at 10 to 15 grams of fiber a day. And the studies are robust on the effect of fiber on cholesterol. The greater the fiber in your diet, the better the cholesterol numbers, the less the risk of heart disease and even all-cause mortality. So it's very important to add fiber into your diet.
Wasn't there a very recent big retraction of an LDL study that had to do with some of this stuff in terms of like the carnivore and keto crowd? Because one of the things that really irks me about that crowd is the dismissal of fiber. Like, you don't need it, or it's associated with these toxic killer plants that exist in the world. Plants kill you and like weird stuff like that. I say weird, but
yeah, when they're talking about plants kill you, most of the time when I see that, they're talking about lectins, and lectins are the plant's defense chemicals that prevent other plants from invading their space. Like this is what I need for my roots to grow. Stay away, But and then there have been some in vitro studies, test tube studies that cells can be damaged by these. And then there's also like the anti-nutrient data, but that's really old data. Like I learned that when I took my courses at UF in nutrition. But thankfully, science evolves and changes. And if you're looking at that, you're looking at like 30-year-old nutrition data. And really, it is beneficial, and they're finding more and more benefits of that through roughage. So your intestinal lining has these finger-like projections, these villi, and each one is very important for nutrient absorption. And you need the fiber to be like that, the straw broom to slough off all the old cells and keep it fresh and vibrant and able to absorb all the nutrition from the food that you eat, which you do absorb all the nutrition from the food that you eat, but it just keeps it all healthy. Because if you don't absorb all of your fat, for example, like you can do a fecal fat test where even if you lose 6 grams of fat, you have some degree of fat malabsorption, maybe from cystic fibrosis or from some kind of bowel condition. So fiber is important because it helps with your postprandial glucoses. It helps with the intestinal health, and it feeds the microflora of the gut. And lots of research has come out now regarding the immunity that is in your gastrointestinal system, especially your small intestine, and that you get this nutrition that the bacteria really like. You've got your Bacteroides and your Firmicutes, and you want more of the good bacteria to proliferate, the good colon bacteria that's going to keep you healthier than the bad.
Sometimes I just want to make it a matter of it's going to keep you more full. It's actually going to reduce your calories. It's going to be associated with healthier, more nutritious foods anyway, like fruits and vegetables and grains and such. But you point out also the gut health aspects of it that cannot be underrated at all. And having a diverse microbiome. You mentioned gut issues, right? There's people with ulcerative colitis and IBS and all that, where there's a whole gut connection. And then I think my brain went to LDL just because there's also correlation with reduced LDL cholesterol and things like that with fiber. So meaning it's important.
I know there's so many things. And I do believe we haven't even elucidated all of the things,
So don't cut it out, guys. Don't go carnivore. Okay. So, all right. To kind of wrap it up, because we talked about a lot of things, but I think the audience also wants to know, like, is there something they're not doing, something specific, something actionable related to insulin sensitivity? I know we got some tips today, like test your fasting insulin. I think that's a super easy tip.
Yeah.
And a few other things. Is there something we didn't cover? Something you're like, yeah, you guys do this thing. It's easy. It's simple. It's going to help you out.
The obvious one would be move after meals. That's going to increase your sensitivity to insulin for sure. Lifting, because the more lifting you do, the more trained your muscles, the more sponge effect, if you will, they're going to have. And the post-meal walking is very research-based, especially in the world of diabetes.
Actually, I want to ask you about the movement after meals because I usually tell people, like, step 1, move, doesn't matter when. Step 2, move after meals if you can, like be specific
the
about
timing.
it.
Yeah.
But what about not moving? In other words, what's the impact? Because I've seen a few studies on this, but the impact of not moving on insulin resistance.
Yeah, it's bad. Don't not move.
Like, even if you're training and getting, like, let's say you get enough steps and you're training, but then you're sitting for hours and hours and hours because of your job.
Yes, you could get your daily workout in, but if you're sedentary the entire rest of the day, it's going to have deleterious effects for sure. And that is also backed by research. That is just, it's your sedentary lifestyle as a whole, even if you've got that time picked out that you run around like a maniac and get stuff done. It's cumulative.
And does it come down to like the mechanisms like the GLUT4 transporters specifically, or is there a specific mechanism of like sitting for a long time? Do you know what I mean? Like with the blood flow or something?
I mean, there's so many different things. You've got PPAR gamma, you've got GLUT4 pathway, you've got like, I wouldn't say that's the thing. It's cumulative movement and keeping your body, people have used the term keeping your sword sharp. And I love that term personally. I just think it's important to look at where you are and think, where can I add more? Very much like with our nutrition discussion, where can we refine this and fine tune it and just be the best you that you can be and do the best that you can with your movement. I think it's going to help you with your knees and your back. And like, we weren't made to sit hours upon hours of the day staring at a screen. I think you and I are both standing, and we're doing that on purpose.
Yep. Exactly. It's so funny. Yeah. I stand all the time now. It's great. All right. So as we wrap up, I want folks to know, you guys have a podcast, the Diabetes Podcast. I was on it, but you've also got fantastic episodes. I think you're up to over 50 episodes now. Is there one that's like a really good one we want to point folks to?
I would say I did one that really specifically looks at the environment and its role in diabetes and policy change. I would love for people to take a look at that one because it is out of control. And there are lots of reasons why. And I don't think that it can be fixed by any one thing or any one person. And that's kind of why we moved our role from just consulting to the podcast. Because like, how do we get the message out to reach the most people that they really understand that it's not just personal responsibility. Like personal responsibility is number 30 on the list of things that got us where we are. So there's that one. And then there's also one that's called Prediabetes is Diabetes. And I think that's a really, really important one, especially for your listeners.
What I really like about your podcast with Richie is the episodes are like very thoughtfully constructed and really deep into that topic. And you cover like all the things people want to know. And so that's episode 47, Prediabetes is Diabetes, which is a good look at like, if you don't do the things, where are you going to end up? And then episode 51, the diabetes epidemic, is probably a really good understanding of, we've alluded to the whole pie chart of, you talk about fiber and like no PE in schools and screen time and, butyrate and inflammation, all the things. So guys, check that out. There you go. I hear you. All right. So check those out. We're going to throw the links. Anywhere else we want to send folks to, Amber?
The diabetespodcast.net is where you can find all the notes, all the other episodes. There's things on fiber, carbohydrates, all sorts of stuff.
Great. So whether you have diabetes or not, you guys need to check Amber's podcast out. And Amber, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. Time flew by, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Philip.
This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Please consult your healthcare provider before making any health changes. Some links mentioned may be affiliate links, which means I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you if you choose to purchase.